Roger Cohen is a columnist for the New York Times, where he has worked since 1990 as Paris correspondent, bureau chief in the Balkans and Berlin, and foreign editor. Prior to that, he was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. His books include Soldiers and Slaves, American POWs Trapped by the Nazis' Final Gamble, and Hearts Grown Brutal, Sagas of Sarajevo. His new book, The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family, is the story of his family's suffering and success from Lithuania to South Africa, London, and Tel Aviv. Within it is the broader story of Jewish devastation, displacement, and cultural identity. Leon Wieseltier was until recently the literary editor of The New Republic. He is currently a contributing editor and critic at The Atlantic. His books include Kaddish and Nuclear War, Nuclear Peace. Please welcome Roger Cohen and Leon Wieseltier to the JCCSF.
Good evening. It's like after they put the Torah back. Roger and I, who are old friends and comrades, are going to be discussing his book and then the world. And I'm going to begin with some conversation about this extraordinary book, and then we'll open it up in our discussion, and then there will be questions, hopefully of an interrogative kind. And this is, if those of you haven't read this book, I can report that it is a gorgeous book. It is a soulful book. It is a book that accomplishes something. Roger, you'll just have to suck this up.
I'll try, Leon.
Yes.
I'll try.
It is a book that accomplishes something that's very hard to do, which is that it somehow manages to incorporate the story of individual history with collective history. It moves from a family and certain individuals in a family to the very largest framework of the 20th century, actually earlier too, but mainly the 20th century history of the Jews and all its turbulences. It is a book by a son and a book by a Jew. And I guess one definition of being a Jew is being a son or a daughter, as the case may be. Why don't we begin, Roger, by talking a little bit about the question of uprootedness. The whole, in your book you describe Jews who moved around the world under the pressures of history, none of which they asked for, of course. You describe very probingly the psychology, the spirituality, really, of people who live either in the wrong places or in places where they feel they don't belong. Why don't we talk about that?
Well, thank you, Leon, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out tonight. It's always a pleasure for me to be back in San Francisco. I was just thinking it's 41 years since I was hitching around the United States and saw the Grateful Dead play San Francisco, and it remains
things have changed, Roger.
One of them, one of my greatest memories.
Insofar as you can remember.
I was internally displaced as I watched it, but nevertheless, the pleasure was intense. Now then, yes, this is a central theme of the book. I was born in London to South African immigrant parents, and I knew very little, really, of the history of the family. The goal was assimilation. The goal was to become English. We didn't hide who we were. We were called Cohen. But that was not, our Jewish identity was not really, it was peripheral. And as I grew up, and when I was called an effing yid and a Jew boy in school, I began to think about what I didn't know. I had a very privileged upbringing in Britain. I was at Westminster School, one of the finest schools in Britain. I'd sit in Westminster Abbey most mornings, and I had no idea that my grandmother had come from the Lithuanian shtetl. And my family has moved with every generation in the last 4, from Lithuania to South Africa to Britain, then apart went from South Africa to Israel, and I've become an American and moved on to New York. And the more I began to think about this, and the more I began also to think about my mother's breakdown when she was plucked out of a very tight-knit and prosperous Jewish community in South Africa. Her grandfather had been penniless when he arrived in South Africa, but he began as a smouse, itinerant salesman, then had a small retail operation, and then started the Macy's of South Africa, the OK Bazaars, which then went bankrupt. But there was a phase in there where there was quite a lot of money, and my mother grew up in these circumstances, was plonked down in post-war Britain with its rationing still, putting pennies in the meter for hot water, and with a very hard-driving young husband and pregnant with my younger sister. And she cracked up. And in the book, I wanted to tell an intimate story of my mother's breakdown, because since she died 15 years ago, there'd been this knot inside me about her life and about what I didn't know about her life. And we all have something that makes us tick. And for me, it's words. If I have a knot, I try and write the knot out word by word. And I thought that in my mother's story of displacement, there lurked a wider story of people, not just Jews. It's principally about Jews, but it's called The Girl from Human Street. I think it's a very basic urge, this quest, this longing, this desire to belong. I think it's right up there with love, and it's probably among the 3 or 4 most basic human urges, is this urge to belong. And I think when you're moving with each generation, that's very hard. We think of immigration in the United States as new hope, new opportunity, but its black sun is lost. It's what you leave behind, and what sometimes you strive, usually fruitlessly, I think, to forget.
And the inner resources of immigrants have to be prodigious if they're not going to be defeated by the experience. His Jewish identity has survived for all these many centuries because it became portable. And what's so moving about your portrait of your mother is that it's a portrait of a woman whose identity turned out not to be really portable, that somehow she really did not, she needed her place. And
she did. She always craved South Africa, particularly as her life went on. And I actually think that her Jewish identity was stronger than my father's. He was a very distinguished, is still, nearly 94, very distinguished scientist, immunologist, expert on malaria, and he'd hated his bar mitzvah. He saw, it was obscurantist to him. He believed in something more universalist. He wanted to move out from Jewish identity. When he moved to Britain, one of his aunts in South Africa said to him, "You'll never make it in Britain as a Cohen. You really must change your name." And he said, "Okay, well, I'll think about that. Let me think about it." And he went away for 3 or 4 days and went back to see this aunt. And she said, "So, Sidney, what did you decide?" And he said, "Well, I've been thinking about it, and you're right. I'm going to change my name." And she said, "Oh, really? That's wonderful. To what?" And he said, "Einstein." My dad was not a man who was going to change his name. He was not going to hide who he was, but it didn't interest him particularly. My mother, on the other hand, I think her uncle, great-uncle, my great-great-uncle, was a rabbi, and was one of the things I discovered writing the book, who was the chaplain to Jewish soldiers in the British Army during World War I. And I found his diaries in the University of Southampton, and it was quite fascinating to me, going back to what we were talking about. he wrote, for example, in 1918, I'm paraphrasing, has the house of Israel at last demonstrated with its sacrifice that we are loyal citizens, loyal to the crown and to the empire? Always this question of belonging. Do we belong? Do we really belong? And I think for my mother, that definitely lingered there. And she was uneasy. The transmission belt, as you just said, is the parchment passed down, the words passed down through the millennia. And I felt personally, and it's one reason I've returned to a Jewish identity, that for this transmission belt to end, it's some kind of tremendous betrayal of what came before. And I think my mother found really nothing to replace that. She always, I recount in the book how we sat when I was in my teens in a restaurant in London, and she said she was eating spaghetti, I remember, and my mother always used to cut up her spaghetti and eat it on a spoon. And she said to me, "Darling, you see that family over there?" I said, "Yeah, I see them." She said, "Well, they're Jewish." And I said, "Mom, why are you whispering?" And she said, "I'm not whispering, but they are Jewish." And this is Philip Roth's observation also about being Jewish in Britain. If you're discreet, you make your way, and Jews do very well in Britain. But for me personally, coming to New York and seeing that, oh, you can live Jewishness exuberantly was an extraordinary discovery.
American Jews do not whisper.
They do.
Just, I mean, it's,
do they not, Leon?
No. A little whispering would actually go a long way around here. One of the things that your book recounts is the awakening of your own Zionism. And Zionism, among its many other qualities, is not just an affirmation, a positive affirmation of Jewish peoplehood and so on, but it also is an expression of despair with the Jewish experiment in belonging in Europe, especially, historically speaking. But in your case, too, judging by what's in the book, there is some sense in when
exactly that. I think I think it was a reluctant conclusion.
Yeah.
It was reluctant. I think Herzl, covering the Dreyfus case 120 years ago in Paris as a foreign correspondent, I think his conclusion, observing these false accusations against a Jewish officer in the French army and observing the tremendous outburst among the anti-Dreyfusards of a virulent anti-Semitism, it was a significant factor in his writing The Jewish State. And in my own family's case, they fled the shtetl in Lithuania because of the pogroms there. They were privileged in South Africa because they were the right color, and members of my family used to say, remember, darling, if there weren't tens of millions of blacks as a buffer to persecute, you know, when you're persecuting tens of millions of blacks, you don't have a lot of time left over for tens of thousands of Jews.
Right.
And a lot of Jews went along, more Jews as a group among whites than any other, of course, fought apartheid, including some of my relatives, and most of Mandela's attorneys, as you know, were Jews. But even in South Africa, I know my father and uncle told me about being excluded in school, and this unease was always there, and certainly it's always there in Europe. And my own Zionism, I suppose, was, I don't see any other conclusion. Half acceptance into Christian societies proved more dangerous for the Jews than non-acceptance. It was as the Jews in France, in Germany, and elsewhere emerged in the professions into European societies that really the seeds were scattered for what became Nazism. And my great-uncle's anxiety in Britain proved absolutely well-founded. An Iron Cross for valor at the Somme for a German Jewish officer did not prevent him being sent to the gas 30 years later.
I mean, it is historically, psychologically, easy to understand why Jews would have wished to integrate into Europe, especially at a time when it seemed like Europe was becoming an enlightened place. But what happened eventually with Herzl and others, and what seems to be part of your story here, is that finally the experience of history leads one to the conclusion that the experiment failed in some way.
Yeah, it did, and we're seeing in Europe today.
That's right. That's right.
The shootings in Brussels at the Jewish Museum, and of course what has just happened in Paris in the kosher supermarket. And there's a significant exodus right now from France because of this new fear in Europe. We're not back in the 1930s, far from it.
No.
And what we're seeing is the seeping of poisonous Middle Eastern politics into Europe. But it is a worrying situation.
But there is this feeling.
And, you know, of course, the state of Israel is a miracle. It's remarkable. But my own Zionism is a liberal Zionism. I don't think a Jewish state founded on the statelessness of another people is what the original Zionists had in mind. And I see the messianic Zionism that is often ascendant in Israel today, which believes that all the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River was deeded to the Jews in the Bible. I think it's very corrosive, and fundamental in Jewish teaching, obviously, is we were strangers in strange lands. We should invite the stranger, and that which is hateful to yourself, do not do to another. I mean, these are very fundamental Jewish ethics, which I think are being challenged by the current situation.
Well, we're certainly of one view about that. The pathos of the situation of the French Jews, which repeats a situation that Jews found themselves in earlier, which is why the massacres have created for the French Jews, or crystallized for the French Jews, a kind of classical Zionist moment, is that their confidence in liberalism to protect them has been rattled. After all, France is a liberal state. And in some ways, the melancholy aspect of it is their decision, and this was the case of many Western European Zionists, that liberalism
It was a
in
melancholy
Europe,
decision.
It's a melancholy decision.
I think that's a very good way of putting
Absolutely. It was, I mean, in Eastern Europe and in Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, it was different. There was no liberalism, there was no middle class, there was no revolution of rising expectations. But in Western Europe, it was, and so you're right, basically what Zionist Jews should do is, having despaired of liberalism in Europe, basically take their liberalism with them to their own state and enact it there.
You know, it's a very old story in France. I've been thinking about it a lot since what happened at Charlie Hebdo and at the kosher supermarket. You know, looking back to Dreyfus, and of course France is a secular state.
Yeah.
It tries to make no distinctions, but you have a very combustible situation there now, I think, with a marginalized and large Muslim community and a Jewish community that's increasingly fearful. And I was in Israel recently, and I visited an old friend of mine, a movie director called Micha Shagria.
Oh, you're an old friend of mine too.
Yeah, and he's dying of cancer. He's in a hospice. And he was, the illness, it had been in him for a while, but had not become apparent. But it manifested itself in Paris less than a year ago, when he was found wandering around in a dazed and disoriented state, not knowing where he was. Now, Micha's wife, Aliza, was killed in the bombing of the synagogue on the Rue Copernic in 1980. And one of the ideas, I don't think that Micha was not in Paris because of Aliza, but I can't help seeing in this one of the themes I try to get at in the book, which is that trauma lives on in ways that we don't fully understand. And to me, it cannot be simply a coincidence that Micha was found 30 years on from this, 35 years on from this terrible event, in this dazed and disoriented state, wandering around Paris. And even though my mother, there's always the question with manic depression, and she also suffered from what was then called post-puerperal psychosis, now postpartum depression. there's always the question, and I think mental illness is still the last taboo. There's always the question of whether it's endogenous, just you were unlucky with your genes, or exogenous, caused by external factors. And I became convinced that it was impossible to look at what happened to my mother without seeing the element in it of this trauma, of her losing her home, losing where she belonged, losing this environment. When I think of my mother, I think one reason I'm so drawn to South Africa is if I close my eyes and think of her in South Africa, I see her laughing. I see her in a floppy sun hat on a beach, smiling. When I think of her in Britain, I think of her either manic, doing sometimes crazy, uncontrolled things, buying a ticket on Concorde. She left her belongings in Fortnum and Mason's at the height of the IRA, and when the security guards came and said, "What's this?" She lost it. She was screaming at them. They locked her up in a room. I'm a magistrate. She was so indignant. And one of the things about manic depression is that the manic states give you plenty of reason for guilt in the depressive phase, and it is a devastating condition. And I wanted to get to the bottom of my mother's story, and I wanted to get to the bottom of where I came from. And I think those two things are really what came together in the book. And I was able to discover, because I never knew what happened to my mother when I was nearly 3, and she disappeared for 2 years into psychiatric institutions. Nothing was ever said about this in my family until she began to break down again 15 to 20 years later. And through Britain's Freedom of Information Act, I was able to find a few scraps of her medical records from 1958. So I now know that on June 30, 1958, she was having electroshock treatment. And this was the kind of electroshock treatment, of course, that Sylvia Plath had. It was on more or less exactly the same time as Sylvia Plath describes in The Bell Jar. It was a pretty
plates over the head.
Yeah, it was a pretty violent thing.
Yeah.
They would strap you down so that your limbs were not dislocated by the current. And again, on August 1, 1958, one day before my 3rd birthday. So I can now see my mother, I can picture my mother, and I think it's painful as it is. I think we need to remember, we need to know, we need foundations. And what foundations can you build if you don't know the story of your family and you don't know the story of where you came from? And this is what I felt I had to explore and try to write about. And as a columnist, of course, I get a lot of emails, and I do think that some of the mental illness and some of this desire to belong that I try to explore in the book, it's quite, I think it's a more widespread condition than perhaps we imagine. There's a lot of unease out there amid a humanity that is perhaps more fluid than ever and often more uncertain about where home lies.
In this book, which recounts, as I say, the discovery of your own positive feelings about Jewish identity and Zionism and the historical necessity for a Jewish homeland and so on, the figure of your mother haunts that story in the following sense, that what's sometimes lost in all the upbeat accounts of Zionism and in all the expressions of pride, of Jewish pride and so on, is that there are people who are inconsolable about the loss of what they knew. And all the ideology in the world, there are people for whom it will never suffice to heal the rupture of either having been robbed or expelled from their home, or of simply of movement. I mean, racination is a very, very powerful thing.
It was a huge trauma for my mother. Look, my family was lucky. We skirted the horror. We skirted the horror. I went back to Zagadeh, in northern Lithuania, and Shavil, as it was called in Yiddish, in northern Lithuania, where my family was from. And on June 2, 1941, everybody, all the Jews, 2,473 of them, were shot dead and buried out in the forest. And so that's what would have happened to my family. Lithuanian Jews were killed fast and killed locally. They did not go to the gas. There were no gas chambers. Between June and December 1941, before the Wannsee Conference, the Jews of the Baltics were wiped out. And that is where the Nazis crossed the psychological barrier to killing women and children en masse. And it's, you know, these are devastating stories.
My family was, it didn't skirt my family. It visited them directly in Poland. And one of the things that always puzzled me as a child growing up among Holocaust survivors is this strange mixture of contempt for where they came from because of all the evil that was perpetrated there, with a strong degree of nostalgia. With a strong degree of nostalgia.
It was very moving for me going back to Zagreb. I'd never heard of it growing up. I had no idea. I mean, my grandmother used to speak in Russian to her parrot, but apart from that, there was absolutely no connection. And one of the moving things for me in the exploration, it was a voyage of discovery, this book. I was going back, I was trying to reel in the past. And because of the internet, of course, the Zagreb diaspora is more linked than it's ever been since the Jews disappeared from Zagreb. Just before I got there, the last Jew in Zagreb had died. And a Lithuanian man had the idea that instead of, because what happened in Zagreb happened in every Lithuanian town. And there are ditches, and if you delve into the forest there, you find these hidden plaques that used to say, under the Soviets, that
victims of fascism,
victims of fascism, no identification of Jews. Then it got a little better after Lithuanian independence, and it said they were Jews, but it did not say that some were killed by the Lithuanian accomplices of the Nazis. And now, in Zagreb, for the first time, and it's in one of the last chapters of my book, a plaque was put up, not in the forest, in the main square, saying that almost 3,000 Jews had been killed on October 2nd, 1941, by the Nazis and their Lithuanian accomplices. It can take a very long time, ladies and gentlemen, to get to historical truth. And it's very important. I covered the war in the Balkans, in Bosnia. It was all about distorted memory. It was about nationalist leaders who reopened old wounds, who used old grievances, who traded in the
14th century
traded in the absence of historical truth. That was their raw material, the fact that there was no agreed upon history. And it's very dangerous. You need to try and establish what happened. Even if in Israel-Palestine, I often think it doesn't matter any longer what happened in 1948. Palestinians and Jews, Arabs and Jews will never agree on the narrative of 1948. But please, let's be more prosaic. Let's try to put food on the table. Let's think of the future, not the past. But unfortunately, the current leaders are very reluctant to do that.
Well, one of the interesting things, one way to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of the question of displacement and racination is that what you have is a conflict. The Palestinians, or many of them, refuse to settle for anything but the return of their grandfather's house and olive tree, of their home. And the Jews, or some of them, believe that every place a Jew once lived, Jews must always live. And peace between Israelis and Palestinians in some ways will be premised upon their willingness to leave home for the sake of a larger home.
Exactly. I'm not very interested in the olive groves of 1948, and I'm not very interested in the notion of land somehow deeded in the Bible. Why is this land ours? Because it is. That's what you hear sometimes.
Well, anyway, the state of Israel.
Look, if you're trying to, you need basic signals. If you're trying if you're serious about a two-state peace, which I think is the only kind of peace that's possible, while you're negotiating, I don't think it's helpful to expand the settlements. In fact,
it's lunatic.
I think it's lunatic.
It's lunatic.
And on the other side, if you're serious about if you're interested in the 1967 lines and not 1948, not pushing the Jews into the sea again, which is never going to happen, it is not helpful, it is equally not helpful to continue with incitement against Jews, and both sides have to be more serious.
Well, but the conclusion to which one inevitably comes is that since none of them are fools, and they all know this, the people who are now in charge of both Palestinian affairs and Israeli affairs are fundamentally not interested in a two-state solution.
I think that's the only conclusion.
It's the only conclusion one can come to.
And it's one reason the Israeli election on March 17 is very important. When I was in Israel in December, in any democracy there's a shelf life for a leader, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has now been in office for 9 years, and I sense for the first time a real fatigue with his leadership. But Israelis want to be assured that any alternative in a crisis will see leading Israel somebody who will guarantee the security of Israel. And that's the challenge to Isaac Herzog, the Labour Party leader, and Tzipi Livni. But one reason I think a change of leadership is would be very important is precisely that, because Livni and Herzog are no doves, but I do think that they see the conundrum. Israel cannot remain a Jewish and democratic state if it continues to occupy all the land, because one day there will be more Arabs on that land. One day, quite soon, more Arabs on that land. They see it, they understand it, and they believe in a two-state outcome. I have never been convinced that Prime Minister Netanyahu believed in that. So that is a very fundamental difference.
I think that's right. I think that there's always been the Zionism of numbers and the Zionism of borders. Mm-hmm. And Netanyahu comes from the tradition of the Zionism of borders that insists either upon Jabotinsky's idea of borders, of the patriarch Abraham's idea of borders, as if the Bible has a damn thing to do with the state of Israel anyway. Right. And then there's the Zionism of numbers, according to which the whole purpose of the state is that there be a place in which the Jews are permanently the majority. Now, there is an irony here, going back to France and your book, which is this. Israel was founded upon essentially a European kind of nationalism. That is to say, the kind of nation-state that Israel was taken from the European idea that every nation should be incarnated in a state, and every state should reflect a nation, that the political and the cultural boundaries should coincide. And since they never do, all European nation-states had the so-called problem of minorities, which is Israel having reproduced that kind of nationalism, which has no natural understanding of multi-ethnicity at all, but sees it only in terms of the majority and the problem of minorities. Israel has now inherited that problematic structure, and it's very difficult. I mean, I don't know about you. It's a very sad thing to admit, but I have basically given up on the prospect of seeing peace there in my lifetime. I don't believe I'm going to see it.
Yeah, I haven't given up. That's not a rational position, but I've not given up. I guess I've seen, maybe it's the South African in me. I spent my whole childhood hearing about the inevitable cataclysm. It was coming. The blacks at the horizon would come and take everything. And my relatives were always saying, when I went out there every December, January, enjoy the swimming pools. Next year they'll be red with blood. Yeah. And it never happened. And why did it never happen? Because of leadership, because of de Klerk and Mandela. And it's an extraordinary thing, and it marked me. And I was also marked, of course, as we all were, by the end of the Cold War. I mean, again, nobody foresaw it. I think these huge events are very seldom foreseen. The Arab Spring has turned bitter, but Nobody foresaw that. And again, it was about empowerment. It was about individuals saying they should have a say in the running of their countries. So, and I was recently reviewing Lawrence Wright's book on Camp David for the New York Review of Books. And again, we come back to leadership. Begin was the first right-wing prime minister of Israel. And he went into those talks since the country's foundation. And he went into those talks with one bottom line. He was never, ever, under any circumstances, going to give up the settlements in Sinai. In fact, he was going to retire to one of the settlements in Sinai. And what did he do? He gave up the settlements in Sinai. And President Sadat, who paid it with his life, as we know, was intensely pragmatic. He wanted Sinai back. That's what he wanted. He wanted an end to the wars with Israel, which had taken more than 100,000 Egyptian lives. And he wanted to align Egypt with the United States, bring it out of the Moscow camp. He achieved his objectives. He was fiercely pragmatic. I wish there was more pragmatism on the Palestinian side. I really do. I think there's a lot that could be learned from Sadat in terms of you can't get everything. You simply can't. And Mahmoud Abbas is 80 years old now, and I don't think he's prepared to tell the Palestinians the tough things, which include the fact that we're not going back to Haifa. We're not going back to those olive groves. We can have a state of our own. We can build something wonderful. And 100 years from now, maybe the border between Palestine and Israel will be as meaningful as the border between Israel and France. Speaking of miracles, I lived in Berlin for 3 years, and I would drive into Poland 70 miles away. The Poles know something about having the Germans that close. And you didn't even know where the border was, in a place where 12 million people were killed 70 years ago. So I don't give up.
You know, there's a wonderful line in a play by Oscar Wilde. In Salome, Herod and Herodiad are out on the terrace, and there's a shooting star. And Herodiad says it's a miracle, and Herod says, I don't believe in miracles. I've seen too many.
Yeah.
I think that there is some basis, of course, to what you're saying. Yeah. People do forget that when the Zionists accepted partition, it required the renunciation of the maximalist Zionist vision.
Yes, it
that
did.
Is and that renunciation
was
such
very
a bitter,
pragmatic.
and to the extent to which the Zionist camp actually it resulted in civil war. There was actually violence about this.
There was.
And people do not, but the Palestinian leadership has consistently refused to do what Ben Gurion did, consistently. That is, faced with the choice between a state that expresses less than their full vision on the one hand, and continued Palestinian wretchedness on the other. They have consistently chosen to preserve the integrity of the national movement, whatever that means. There is no such integrity.
And it's divided right now.
It has been divided for decades.
Yeah. Speaking of miracles, could I tell the story of one miracle in my book?
Yes.
It concerns my uncle, Bert Cohen, who died last year at the age of 95.
Oh, the bird.
And he was an immense figure in my life. He was a wonderful writer, and I discovered, reading his diaries, that I always knew he was passionately interested in writing. And in fact, one of his last acts before he died was to read my book and, as usual, correct my spelling. And I'm very grateful to him for that. But Bert Cohen, as a young man, enlisted in Johannesburg in 1943, and he was flown up to Cairo, where he spent some time drinking bad Egyptian whiskey, and then shipped out and landed in Taranto on the heel of the Italian boot in late 1943, and then fought the entire Italian campaign with the Allies, doing dental surgery in improvised conditions, often freezing in the Apennines. Anyway, he, and Leon I think has heard this story before, but and it's in the book, he was in Florence, near Florence, reconnoitering in the summer of 1944, when a bird landed on his shoulder. And that bird stayed there for 6 days. And Florentines thought that Captain Bert Cohen, young Jewish officer, was a saint. And they would come up to him with their children and say, Leon, Santo, you're a saint. Will you bless our children? Well, you may imagine what my uncle knew about such Catholic blessings, but he vaguely, he told me, remembered the mnemonic, spectacles, testicles, wallet, cigar. And so was able...
American Jews are not raised on that.
Yeah. And so was more or less able to satisfy these impassioned Florentine women. And on day 4, while he was doing these blessings, an American officer came up to him and said, "Say, Captain, you've got a bird on your shoulder." And he said, "Yeah, I know. It's been there for 4 days. You mind if I take a photograph?" "No, sure." So there's a photograph of my uncle in Florence with this bird on his shoulder. And right after the photograph was taken, and there's a passage in his diary about this, the bird flies off across the Arno, disappears, and Bert is deeply despondent. He's bereft. He'd called the bird Ishbel, and he'd become used to Ishbel's presence on his shoulder. And he describes walking down the Arno when 15 minutes later, Ishbel comes winging across the Arno and lands again on his shoulder.
The right of return.
The right of return. And stays there for another 2 days. So, never forget the miracles. But Leon, could I ask you a question?
Yes.
What are we to make of this metastasizing and heinous ideology that is drawing young Muslims from Europe to Syria and elsewhere, and was behind the murder? We're journalists. We've sat around tables. We've thought about next day's stories, cartoons. But some guy comes in and in the name of this ideology wipes everyone out. Then the kosher supermarket. President Obama, when he speaks of this, speaks of extremists. He doesn't speak of Islamist extremists or identify this ideology in any way, even with a perversion of Islam. What is to be done? How should we see this ideology? How do we fight it? We've been trying to fight it for quite a long time now.
I think there are many things to be said about it. Some of them are these. In the first place, these people are not to be described as nihilists or as operating a cult of death. This is a belief system. They believe in certain positive propositions. And we have to recognize that part of their appeal is to the wounded identities of Muslims in many countries. The second thing is that it is idiotic not to refer to it as Islamist terrorism. But when one does that, one has to recognize that Islam, like Judaism, like Christianity, is not just a religion, it's a civilization, and it contains all the temperaments, and there are all the vices and all the virtues in it. And that Islam, like Judaism and like Christianity, but especially like Judaism, is a religion of interpretation. And what people like the president don't understand is that this is an interpretation of Islam. And there are other interpretations of Islam. One of the things that is so frustrating to behold or not to behold for me, and I don't read Arabic, I'm embarrassed to say, or Urdu, so I can't follow it, is that one looks for a war of ideas within the Islamic world. One looks for the assertion of the other Islams, as it were.
One does.
And again, one doesn't see them, at least in what I read in the various Western languages. I think that these are the upside of this, and it's hard to begin a sentence that way, is that every attempt to modernize, and this was true of the West too, always produces a great recoil from modernization. And I think that as these societies begin to understand that they have to begin to open up to not just to the West, but to democracy, to technology, to social progress, and so on. The Saudis are going to begin to have to deal with this, and so on. This produces a corresponding recoil, this horror of modernity, this horror of democracy. And that's partly what we're seeing. I don't know, the question of how do we fight it, not with 120,000 troops, but not without military force at all. I think what's happened in this country, and Obama's particularly prone to this, is that the only options that seem to to confront the United States are either inaction or the war in Iraq. And the war in Iraq was a fluke. That's not going to happen again. And anyway, we can't democratize a country with 120,000 troops. But in countries in which there are democratizing movements, in Iran, in elsewhere, in Syria certainly there are things, many things we can do, and we have to recover our sense of agency. But the truth is, it really will depend on those societies themselves. That's the good news and the bad news. That's the good news and the bad news. And that means that there is a process of secularization, of modernization. The grip of the mosque on the public square has got to be broken. And again, we should remember, and I don't mean to go on about this, the struggle to break the grip of the church on the public square in Europe was a struggle that lasted 200 to 300 years, and books were burned and people were burned. So Westerners should not gloat or take for granted that, the liberalism that we finally achieved. But finally, I think it will depend on the internecine struggle within these Arab or Muslim societies, and I think it is our duty as Americans to support whatever democratic forces we find in any of these societies. We can't invent them, but if they're there, it would be the height of folly. That's why in June 2009, when the streets of Tehran and elsewhere in Iran, when they erupted for democracy, the fact that Obama did not immediately kindle to this and see that this was in fact,
Hillary Clinton said recently she regretted that more than any other single thing.
And Tehran is the big prize, right? Let's not call it regime change. Democratization in Iran changes everything, And we have a responsibility to support those people. That's what
it's it's a very worrying situation, I think, in Europe right now. You have more than 1,000 kids from Britain who have left and adhered to Islamic State. More than 1,500 in France, more than 500 in Germany, and many from Belgium. These are not huge numbers, but they're significant numbers, and there's flux back and forth. And we've seen in Belgium and now in France how dangerous that can be. And those responsible for what happened in France started life as petty criminals. They're disaffected. They're getting back to belonging. They don't know where they belong. They don't feel part of the society. And there have been failings on both sides that have created this situation. But I think that combined with rising right-wing parties, weak economies, fearful Jews, marginalized Muslims, it's a heady brew, and there's...
Though I will tell you this, Roger, I'm not one of those people who was ever surprised or disappointed by Europe's failure to integrate the other. My expectations of Europe, owing to what I know from the history of the Jewish experience in Europe, but even the history of the Albigensian experience in Europe, my expectations of Europe in the matter of tolerance have always been very low.
Yeah. It was very interesting, I thought, Leon, there was a piece in the New York Times in my paper shortly after the killings in Paris, and a French Jewish woman was being interviewed, and she was talking about being Jewish in France, and then she said, "Mais mon mari, my husband, c'est un vrai Français. He's a real Frenchman." And there you have what is so different between Europe and the United States in a nutshell. Even this family that may have been in France for 100 years, she, as a Jew, considered her husband, who was not Jewish, presumably, he was the real Frenchman. And I think even in the most open of European societies, which is Britain, we are nowhere near. This is one of the things that drew me so strongly to the United States, apart from the exuberant, non-whispering Jewish condition, was this sense that nobody's particularly interested where you're from. It's what you can do.
It's actually
it's far from perfect. It's
but no, but
immigration
it's actually,
is a big issue. You know, the whole what happened to African Americans over a very long period is a stain on America's conscience. But nevertheless, this fundamental openness is something absolutely exhilarating.
It's even better than that. In Europe, in France, to become a citoyen, and in Europe generally, to be accepted, required a huge degree of self-erasure. And in the United States, for a variety of reasons, not only does it not require the erasure of difference, but difference is actually celebrated. It's the people without the hyphen who seem un-American, which is an inconceivable situation in Europe.
Yeah.
Inconceivable. And I think that what Europe is stuck now in that it's still that old problem of otherness, of difference. And you know, in Europe now, there's this phenomenon that didn't exist 50 years ago or 100 years ago, which is known as multiculturalism. But in the case of England and in France, sometimes I worry that European multiculturalism is basically an excuse for the societies to ignore the actual social and economic realities of those communities. They can just call it a multiculturalism and not, and unless they address those realities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I've never.
Well, I think it was otherness that pushed me out on the road. That's what journalism suited me, because it meshed with this feeling of otherness. I could go out, I could be another, and observe people and try to render in words.
You know, the French writer Péguy, who was a close friend of the Zionist essayist Bernard Lazare, who covered Dreyfus and so on, once said that to be a Jew is to be elsewhere. And there is, now what's interesting about that is that it has all the glamour, as it were, of exile, but Israeli Jews don't think that, and American Jews don't think that. Both of those communities, I mean, you can even think of Israel and America as the two great Jewish experiments in getting away from the terms of Jewish life in Europe. And by the standards of Jewish history, it's an embarrassment of riches, it must be said, because this is the friendliest contest for the Jewish future imaginable. But still.
When I went back to, you know, in New York particularly, in America in general, you forget, you're a Jew and so what, and you live your life and you never hear any comments of the kind that I think first made me think about being a Jew, which I've already described. But when I went back to Britain, because I've been living there for the last 4 years, and I couldn't have written the book without going back. And in fact, it's interesting, because I always used to say, when people ask, why did you leave Britain? I just said, well, I got a job with Reuters, I went overseas, I was a foreign correspondent, one thing led to another. But no, I wanted to leave. I had to leave the locus of the trauma, the whole story of my mother, and that more general feeling of not being entirely part of things. And I went back, so I'd been living in New York for 10 years, and I was, about 2 months after I got back, I was at my sister's place, and she had a lodger at that time, and I'd filed a column, and I had a playback, so at the end of dinner, I had to, at that time the New York Times gave us BlackBerries, now we have iPhones, so I was looking at my BlackBerry, and this guy says to me, oh, you've got a Jewberry. And I said, what? I said, yeah, a Jewberry. I said, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, well, you know, on BlackBerries, there's BlackBerry Messenger, where you can send messages between. He said, well, BlackBerry Messenger, BBM. I said, what about it? He said, well, it's free. So, you know, I just, and other little things, and not so little things. And, you know, the bargain in Britain always seemed to me, you would just be discreet, maybe lower your voice a little bit. Don't, somebody says, oh, that's so Jewish, try to ignore it. Try not to think about what it actually means. And, you know, 250,000 Jews in Britain have done very well. But I see now, since what happened in Paris, there's there's something the government is trying to eradicate anti-Semitism in Britain, see where that goes. I do see Jews raising their voices a little bit more.
Oh, absolutely. In
but
France,
it's I don't know. Should we take some questions?
I think
from
it's
the
time
audience,
for questions.
maybe? Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you to Leon and Roger. And please just put up your hand. Oh, I know you. Here we go.
About an hour ago, you mentioned, I don't have the words exactly, but that, actually I have two questions, that anti-Semitism in Europe is a result of the seeping of Middle Eastern politics into Europe.
Yeah.
Made me wonder what factor, if a factor at all, you felt the occupation is in the growing anti-Semitism in Europe. My second question, learning about your connection, your family connection to South Africa and having a glimpse at your political views, I just can't help but ask you how similar, if at all, you feel the occupation is to apartheid in South Africa.
Right. Well, on the first question, it's certainly a factor. As I said, I think a substantial part of the anti-Semitism you're seeing now in Europe is seeping out of the Middle East. Last summer, at the time of the Gaza war, third Gaza war, I was in Gaza in December. Somebody said to me, a 9-year-old child in Gaza has seen 3 wars, knows 3 wars. That's a 9-year-old child in Gaza's reality. Doesn't need to read any history books or already seen that. And has it changed anything? No, it hasn't. The last Gaza war took 2,300 lives for nothing. Nothing. Hamas is still there. Okay, the tunnels, some of the tunnels were removed, but it was a war that changed nothing. And there will be another one. In any event, while that was going on, you had demonstrations throughout Europe. I was a correspondent in Germany. If you told me when I was a correspondent in 1998, 2001, that there would be people in the street, Germans, in the streets of Germany, Turkish Germans, other Germans, saying, Jews are pigs, I would have said, you're crazy. That's over. That's not going to happen again here. But feeling is running very high in Europe, where incidentally Zionism is now a dirty word. It's interesting for me because in the United States, I tend to be criticized mainly for my criticisms of Israel, for saying that the occupation must end, that you have to get to 2 states. In Europe, I'm criticized more from the other side for being a Zionist, for believing in the need for a Jewish homeland. So I think when Europeans see the continued growth of the settlements, see an occupation that is now coming up, very soon it'll be a half century, and see an Israeli, you can rightly say this is unbalanced, they don't focus as much on the failings on the other side, and that's true, but there's exasperation in Europe, and there's fury, anger, and politicization among the Muslims of Europe, who number in the millions. So I think all that, now, many Europeans will say to you, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. I think the distinction in moments of high emotion like last summer becomes flimsy to the point of being impossible to actually discern. It's an anti-Semitism that falls in, it's an anti-Zionism that falls into anti-Semitism. So to turn your question around, would it make a difference if the occupation ended and a 2-state peace were reached to the climate in Europe and to the degree of anti-Semitism that is beginning to emerge? I think it would make a difference. Would it resolve it? No.
Roger, I have to disagree a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, I agree with every syllable, obviously, as you know, of your critique, of your horror of the occupation and of the settlement policy and so on. That's certainly the case. I think that if it's anti-Semitism we're talking about, there is no rational connection between even the settlement policy, and anti-Semitism. I think generally, as a general rule, in the
could there be an irrational
connection? But in the understanding of prejudice, I think it's very important never to explain a prejudice in terms of the object of the prejudice. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you want to understand racism, you don't study blacks, you study whites, because the whites are the racists. And if you want to understand misogyny, you don't study the women, you study the men. Mm-hmm. Because if you study the women, you're concurring with the misogynists that it actually is a response to something in the women. And if you want to understand anti-Semitism, I believe, you study the non-Jews, not the Jews. I've always thought, for that reason, that anti-Semitism, which is always taught in courses in Jewish history, should be taught in courses in non-Jewish history. Right, because we are not the anti-Semites, we are the Semites. Right? And I think, therefore, I'm a little stricter. I think that most anti-Semitism would be completely unaffected by a change in Israeli government policy, because I think it is now. That does not mean for a second that Israeli government policy should not be changed. I feel like we have to make that clear. But I do think that liberals and doves especially have to be very clear-eyed about the roots of anti-Semitism, the durability of anti-Semitism, and its nature as a prior prejudice. Yeah. And that's, et cetera, et cetera.
I think I agree with what you say, Leon. I wasn't precise enough, but I do think that among young Muslims in Europe, the way the events in the Middle East pervade to them, there is a reaction that spirals out of control. And manifests itself, recently at least, as anti-Semitism, and that is growing. Anyway, to move on to the second question, I don't use the word apartheid for Israeli policies in the West Bank. However, for any South African, anyone who's spent time in South Africa, if you drive along a road, apartheid was a particular system in a particular place, and involved the policies it did toward the heinous policies it did toward the blacks of South Africa. But there are echoes. There are definitely echoes. If you travel on a road in the West Bank and it's for Israelis only, it's not for Palestinians. If you see the kinds of small humiliations that are inflicted on Palestinians, I think, almost daily, it's hard not to feel echoes. And there are a couple of chapters. I follow my family, the Zionists in my family, from South Africa to Israel. And their daughter was manic depressive, the same as my mother. And she committed suicide at the age of 28. And I tell the story of this cousin of mine, and also her parents, one of whom was liberal, and one of whom was a Likudnik. And she, my cousin, always felt these echoes, right from 1967 onward. She was troubled by this sense of another people out there that we're trying to ignore. We're trying to pretend they're not there. Construction everywhere. If we're going to give this land back, why are we building? And her husband would say, get used to it. Get used to it. We won. Yeah. And Russian Jews, of course, the new Russian Jews think, what is this? Give back land you won in conquest? If Russia had ever done that, what would it be today? So they don't get it. But, and I try to, examine this tension through telling the story of my cousin. But yeah, the echoes are there.
Question over here on the right.
You spoke of leadership, and you mentioned in the forthcoming Israeli election two potential leaders, Livni and Herzog. Do you see any successors to leadership in the Palestinian community?
Unfortunately, I do not. I mean, there are people like Dalan, Barghouti, who's in jail, others, but the fact is that before you get, or maybe, I don't know which order it goes in, but the Palestinian leadership is in disarray. When I was in Gaza, everybody I spoke to insulted. Abbas has not been to Gaza. where 1.8 million Palestinians live, who presumably eventually have to be part of any peace settlement. He's not been to Gaza for many years. He didn't go there after the last Gaza war. And the first thing I think that the Palestinians need to do is end the schism within the Palestinian national movement. I think this whole unilateralist tack that Abbas has gone off on after the collapse of the talks, going to the United Nations to try to get a resolution that would set a date and set the boundaries of any Israeli withdrawal, going to the International Criminal Court. I think these are feel-good. Yeah. These are feel-good initiatives. They don't lead anywhere. They don't resolve anything. There hasn't been an election. One reason it's so difficult, I mean, Abbas this month has been in power for a decade. There hasn't been, we don't know what the alignment of forces is within the Palestinian movement because we haven't had an election for 9 years now, and since 2006. And of course, the last election, which was a free and fair election, was won by Hamas, and it produced what it produced. So the experience of elections has not been a happy one, but there has to be an election, and we have to see what the forces are. There has to be unity in the Palestinian national movement, and I think those are fundamental things the Palestinians need to achieve.
Also, there was a genuinely new, different Palestinian leader named Salam Fayyad, and Abbas and Netanyahu both did their best to destroy him. They simply destroyed him.
Yeah, here at last was a Palestinian who was not interested in narrative, who was not interested in the past.
Or an ideology.
He was interested in creating
building
a viable state,
yeah.
to the point that the World Bank 3 years ago said that the West Bank was ready for statehood. That was Fayyad's achievement. What happened to him? He was ostracized by Fatah, by the Palestinians, because he was uncorruptible. He was not a member of Fatah. They didn't trust him. They thought all the cozy deals that exist there, one of the great unwritten stories in the West Bank, would be affected by this. And on the Israeli side, what was perceived in Fayyad, a very presentable Palestinian who spoke excellent English, who'd been educated in Texas, who was attractive to the world, and so Israel tried to discredit him.
And was doing exactly what the Zionists had done when they came to build their state.
That's what I mean by not being serious about getting to two states.
The next question is up here to your left.
Thank you very much. Your comments about South Africa made me feel very nostalgic.
Now there's an accent I recognize.
That's right, okay. You can take the boy out of Africa, but you can't take Africa out of the boy. So my parents came to South Africa from Lithuania and Poland in the 20s and 30s and arrived in a highly stratified society as South Africa is. And they did manage to find a space that was enjoyable for them between somewhere not at the bottom of the totem pole. And so they created an environment which they felt comfortable in. But it was remarkable that from the very beginning of my awareness, they felt that this was not the country for us, for their children. They really felt that this is not where you're going to find your future. And so they insisted on us that we should be educated, highly educated, and pushed us as fast as possible. I remember when the Six-Day War broke out, my parents pushed me into the, and my brother into this environment where we had to sign up to make Aliyah immediately while we were at medical school. And luckily the officer said, no, wait until you finish medical school and then you can help us. But it felt as if they didn't feel we belonged there and wanted us out of South Africa, you know, as soon as possible. And I wondered if you had that same experience, that there was a sense that this was itinerant, this was not going to last, and somebody else was going to push you in a direction that was going to be better for you.
Yes, definitely. You know, I referred to the coming cataclysm, and there was always this sense, precisely that, you put it very well, that this was temporary. When I think of my grandparents, of course, South Africa in the 20th century, there were scarcely better places for Jews to be, on the whole. My grandparents lived the entire My grandmother was born in 1900, died in 2005. She lived the entire 20th century in South Africa, and she went along, as did my grandfather, who was 98. But there was always a feeling that it was going to come to an end. And I think also for Jews, apartheid did hold up a kind of a mirror. Jews had come from Lithuania. 90% of South African Jews are Litvaks. They came from Lithuania, they came from the pogroms, they came from the shtetl. And when they saw persecution on the basis of race, which is what apartheid was, they were troubled. They were probably more troubled than any other members of the white community. And on the one hand, they were privileged by it. On the other, they wanted to look away, to turn away from it. They were perturbed. And I tell the story in my book of a rabbi, Unger, who arrived in South Africa about the time my parents left. My father abhorred apartheid, and it was a fundamental reason why they left. And Unger was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust in Hungary. And he comes to South Africa, and as a young Jew in Budapest, he'd been told which benches he could sit on and which benches he couldn't sit on, which parks he could go into and which parks he could not go into, where he could live and where he couldn't. And the parallels with apartheid, which was being solidified right at that time in South Africa, were overwhelming. And he felt it his duty, that which is hateful to yourself, do not do to your fellow man. He felt it his obligation as a survivor of the Holocaust and an ethical Jew to speak out about this and denounce apartheid. This made the official Jewish community of South Africa very uncomfortable. They held to the position that this was a question for individuals to decide. Individuals might speak out, but the community as a whole, the Board of Deputies of South African Jews, was not going to speak out, and they didn't until very near the end of apartheid. So Unger was expelled from South Africa. And for my father, I was born in London. We went back to South Africa 2 months later. I was an infant. And his last job in South Africa was to be dean of the house at the University of the Witwatersrand that was still accepting black students. There was one house within the university. This was 8 years after the establishment of apartheid in 1948. And it hadn't really tightened its noose completely yet. And it was when that was closed down, and the last opportunity for young black medical students and other students to be educated with whites, when that door was closed, he said enough, and he left. So I think there were two things. There was that unease that I've just described, and then there was the feeling that it was going to end because it was untenable. 4 million Jews, 40 million blacks. How does that work over time, forever? It can't. And, you know, I'm always glass half full on South Africa. To me, there are huge problems of poverty, of crime, violence. But I see some of my cousins who are still there, you know, young, rainbow South Africa. I'm thinking particularly of a cousin of mine who's an attorney there, and he's always rebuking his parents for having gone along with the party. He really believes, you know, that he's a South African. I mean, he's never going to leave. You know, so he stayed. Some stayed, but it was always a slightly uneasy existence, I think. Temporary, exactly that, temporary.
Last question's up here in the middle.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. You have written so much about your experiences in the world, and now you've taken this journey into yourself and into your family and your mother's story. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how the process of writing the book changed how you see yourself and how you see your place in the world and how you approach the world overall.
Thank you, San Francisco, for ending with an easy question. Well, I had to write this book. I was reluctant to write it because it's deeply personal, and it's hard. Finding the right pitch, the right tone, the way you want to tell the story, the way you want to interweave things. And I'd been in Iran in 2009 during the whole upheaval there after the election, and I thought maybe there was a book in that. And my editor, John Siegel at Knopf, had watched over the years as I talked about my family, talked about the story of my mother, and he said, well, you know, Iran's a bit of a downer. Why don't you write a book about suicide, depression, upheaval, loss? More seriously, he wanted me to write this book, and I wanted to write the book, and I needed to look at my own displacement, my own upheaval. I'd written so much about people displaced and forced out or inclined suddenly to leave behind where they had been. It's been a journey. I think I can say now what I couldn't say before, which is that I know what happened to my mother. I have discovered as much as I possibly could about her story, about her initial breakdown, about where she went when she disappeared from my life, which of course injured me psychically, even if I couldn't put it into words at that time, or indeed formulate thoughts about it that I recall in my mind. And I know as much as I could find out about where I came from, what my Jewish story is. And I think that combination of things has given me a new sense of acceptance. I'm accepting, I'm not fighting something, which I feel I was doing for quite a long time. And I feel that acceptance could be the prelude to peace. I don't feel entirely at peace. I didn't have some overwhelming epiphany, but I do feel closer to a kind of peace, and I have a stronger Jewish identity. I guess I look on Israel with more sympathy. I'm more inclined to, for all the errors that I see, and I will continue to criticize the errors I see in my columns, I feel a deep fundamental sympathy with Israel and why it's there and why a Jewish homeland is needed that perhaps I hadn't understood as completely before. So I'm very glad for those reasons that I wrote the book, and I hope it might be in some ways consoling or instructive to others. And we've spoken a lot about suicide, displacement, upheaval. I wouldn't like you to think that that is the fundamental message of the book, because my mother, after mental illness, the cancer she died of 15 years ago was a derisory thing. She held it in complete contempt. It was nothing compared to what she'd been through. And she was unbelievably stoical and loving in death. And her spirit has proved very powerful. And looking back over the peregrinations of my family, I felt repeatedly the force of love and dignity coming through. And I think that's the final message I would like to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.